He burned their bodies in the fireplace, then slept in the same house like nothing happened. Chandler Halderson lied about college, jobs, his entire life, until his father started asking questions. Days later, both parents vanished. Police found human remains in ash, forged texts from the victims, and a chilling calm in their son. What kind of mind can fake love, then erase a family? A reddish smear trailed across the wooden floor, just beyond the edge of the staircase. The kitchen tiles glistened under artificial light, not from polish, but from a thin film of dried blood pooled near the sink. The fireplace in the basement emitted a faint, acrid smell: ash, scorched fabric, and something unmistakably organic. Amid the debris lay fragmented bone, charred to the point of calcification, indistinguishable at first glance from burnt wood. There was no sign of forced entry, no broken locks, no struggle, just the silence of a house that had swallowed its own inhabitants. When law enforcement entered the Halderson residence in Windsor, Wisconsin, it was not due to a burglary or domestic disturbance. It was because Bart and Krista Halderson, two middle-aged parents with no known enemies, had seemingly vanished after telling their son they were headed to the family cabin. But their absence had already stretched beyond what anyone close to them found reasonable. Neighbors hadn't seen their car leave. Krista, punctual and diligent, had failed to show up for work. When police began their search, they weren't looking for a body. They were looking for reassurance. What they found was a staged calm. The family's youngest son, 23-year-old Chandler Halderson, met officers at the door with rehearsed concern. He explained that his parents had gone north with an unknown couple. He'd helped them pack, watched them leave, but there were no suitcases missing, no signs of travel. Surveillance from the area showed no movement from the driveway, and the fireplace, one that had rarely been used, had recently burned for hours during the early morning of July 2nd, precisely the window when the couple was last seen. The forensic scene within the house presented conflicting signals. On the surface, nothing seemed overtly disturbed, but ultraviolet light revealed trace bloodstains across multiple areas: living room, kitchen, basement. A Swiffer mop had been used to clean them ineffectively. Hydrogen peroxide was detected on tile surfaces. In the laundry, clothes had been washed and dried with no explanation. In isolation, none of these details confirmed violence. Together, they suggested intentional removal of biological evidence. Chandler's initial explanation was that he'd cut his foot on broken fireplace glass. He said he'd bled through the house, but the volume, distribution, and cleaning pattern contradicted a simple injury. Pools of blood several inches in diameter, accompanied by drag patterns and high-velocity spatters near baseboards, aligned more closely with violent trauma. Not an accident, not a nosebleed. Something sustained, and something that someone wanted to conceal. Behaviorally, Chandler exhibited traits of controlled deception. He offered unnecessary details, volunteered timelines unprompted, and frequently redirected questions toward logistical minutiae: cleaning products, bandages, video games. He overcompensated with precision, often seen in individuals attempting to mask internal panic with surface-level composure. What was missing was emotional authenticity. There was no visible grief, no confusion, no dysregulation. His affect remained flat, his cadence stable. This detachment, coupled with the calculated erasure of physical evidence, suggested not panic, but premeditation. At this point in the investigation, multiple hypotheses emerged. One considered the possibility of an intruder or third party, but with no signs of entry, no stolen items, and Chandler as the last confirmed person to see both parents alive, probabilities narrowed quickly. The timeline he offered, parents leaving early, not responding due to poor reception, did not match digital data. Their phones had pinged within city limits days after they were supposedly en route to a rural cabin. Chandler's digital footprint also began to unravel. His communications with his girlfriend, Catalin, revealed growing tension in the days leading up to the disappearance. He spoke of being a prisoner, of feeling trapped, and hinted at escalating resentment toward his parents. There were references to debt, to being caught in lies, and to a trip to Florida that was never going to happen. His entire future, school, work, independence, had been a fabrication. When pressed by his father to account for inconsistencies, Chandler had run out of explanations. It is in these psychological choke points that certain offenders cross from avoidance to annihilation. When lies no longer shield them from consequence, some will choose to destroy the source of threat, be it a whistleblower, a witness, or, in this case, parental figures whose only fault was believing in a version of their son that never existed. The blood on the floor was not random. It was directional. It moved toward the basement. It told a story in reverse, not of a sudden attack, but of something dragged, concealed, and methodically dismantled. The question, then, was no longer whether something had happened, but how far Chandler had gone to make sure no one could prove it. The illusion of Chandler Halderson's life unraveled, not with a confession, but with silence. Small gaps between timelines, vague names, and the absence of verifiable facts. What began as a casual inquiry by his father, Bart, into missing tuition records and job details, quickly became a cascade of exposure that the perpetrator could no longer contain. Each question led to another contradiction. Each contradiction forced the construction of more lies. The compounding effect created a psychological pressure point, a collapse not of events, but of identity. Chandler had crafted a narrative of success, telling family and friends that he was enrolled at Madison College, working remotely for SpaceX, and preparing for a promising future in tech. None of it was true. Academic records revealed he had not attended classes for months. There was no job, no internship, no impending move. Instead, he spent his days playing video games, sending forged emails posing as university staff, and fabricating updates to maintain the illusion. These weren't impulsive fabrications. They were methodical, sustained, purpose-built to protect a curated image. The psychological function of this deception appears rooted in two interlinked motivators: fear of failure and the pathological need to avoid accountability. Individuals who rely heavily on external validation, yet lack the resilience to cope with disapproval, often retreat into delusion when faced with scrutiny. In Chandler's case, each lie was designed to forestall the moment when those closest to him, particularly his parents, would confront the discrepancy between who he was and who he claimed to be. There were clear signs of escalating tension within the household. Text message logs revealed that Bart had begun asking for direct contact with school officials, requesting transcripts and setting deadlines. He expressed confusion, then frustration. Krista, while less assertive, began to share her husband's concerns. Chandler's response was not confrontation, but deflection. Vague reassurances, passive resistance, and increasingly implausible explanations. The tipping point came when Bart attempted to call Madison College directly. The threat of exposure had moved from abstract to immediate. In behavioral terms, Chandler's internal framework, built on prolonged deceit, had reached critical instability. At this stage, individuals in similar psychological profiles often perceive two options: submission and collapse of self-image, or the elimination of the threat. What follows is not rational problem-solving, but a cognitive distortion in which violence becomes the only viable form of control. This transition between deception and destruction is where motive transforms into action. It is not born out of sudden rage or impulse, but out of a calculated belief that removal of the external pressure will restore equilibrium. From the outside, the logic appears senseless. From within the distorted cognition of the offender, it is an act of survival. Not physical survival, but psychological continuity. In the days following his parents' disappearance, Chandler's behavior displayed an unusual mix of performance and detachment. He initiated a missing persons report, repeated a narrative involving a cabin trip with an unknown couple, and feigned concern in front of police and neighbors. Yet, inconsistencies in his timeline were immediate. There were no witnesses to the parents' departure. Their phones never left the local area. Bart's work calendar was left open, with appointments unmissed. Krista's employer had received no vacation request. Attempts to confirm Chandler's story through external channels failed repeatedly. The cabin had not been accessed. No surveillance footage supported his claim. A check of his employment records showed no affiliation with any technology firm. Each lie collapsed under minimal scrutiny. And yet Chandler maintained his script, even as it decayed in real time. Forensic review of his devices revealed another layer of manipulation. He had created false emails using spoofed addresses, replicating official school domains, and sent them to his parents as if from advisors. He referred to financial aid documents, student appeals, and scheduling errors. These deceptions extended over several months and required a sustained commitment to detail. This suggests not only premeditation, but a deep-seated belief in his ability to control perception, particularly the perception of those closest to him. This psychological profile is consistent with offenders who exhibit traits of narcissistic vulnerability coupled with antisocial tendencies. There is a craving for admiration, but a simultaneous disdain for authority or confrontation. When exposed, the individual does not seek to rebuild trust or accept failure, but to neutralize whatever threatens their constructed narrative. Often, that includes the very people offering support. By the time investigators turned their full attention to Chandler as the primary suspect, the web of lies had already collapsed. What remained was the question of how far he had gone to protect it, and how long he had been preparing for that moment. The discovery of the body would soon answer that. But it raised another question entirely. At what point does maintaining a lie become more important than preserving a life? The human body found near the tree line of a private rural property was no longer identifiable by facial features or clothing. The torso was partially decomposed, with limbs absent, wrapped loosely in a blue tarp, and left beneath brush and pine needles. Nearby, a used handsaw was located, rusted along the teeth, with tissue residue later matched by DNA to Bart Halderson. This site, just off a walking trail on land familiar to Chandler through his girlfriend's family, became the forensic point of no return. Crime scene technicians documented multiple cuts along bone surfaces, clean, deliberate, and consistent with post-mortem dismemberment. The nature of the incisions indicated that the perpetrator had no formal training, but compensated with time and focus. The absence of hesitation marks or defensive wounds confirmed that the victim had already been deceased prior to dismemberment. The disposal method suggested more than panic. It reflected intention and a goal, not to hide the act, but to erase the person. Back at the Halderson residence, further investigation revealed burnt biological matter inside the basement fireplace. Ash samples tested positive for human fat, bone fragments, and fragments of human vertebrae. Among the debris was a partially melted dental retainer, identified as belonging to Krista Halderson. Investigators found accelerant residue on the fireplace grate, along with a discoloration on the surrounding brick, a clear indication of high-intensity, sustained burning. This was not a symbolic act. It was functional, aimed at permanent destruction. On the surface, these acts might suggest a state of emotional breakdown. However, analysis of Chandler's behavior during and after these events offers little evidence of psychological disintegration. Surveillance from neighboring homes recorded him calmly walking the family dog, disposing of trash, and making small talk with passers-by in the days following the murders. Text messages to friends remained consistent in tone, void of panic or withdrawal. His digital activity, included online searches for fireplace temperatures, sufficient to burn bone, and strategies for body disposal. Each step was methodical. This pattern reveals an offender operating with compartmentalized cognition. The acts themselves, violent, degrading, and deeply personal, were carried out in the same space he continued to eat, sleep, and interact. The capacity to live among these remnants without visible psychological distress indicates a form of dissociation, in which the emotional reality of the act is severed from the physical execution. Offenders who dismember victims within domestic spaces often fall into one of two categories: those attempting to conceal a crime under acute stress, and those seeking to assert control over both the victim and the narrative. In Chandler's case, the forensic evidence and behavioral profile align with the latter. The dismemberment was not driven by fear of discovery alone. It was driven by a need to dismantle the physical evidence of his unraveling life, literally and symbolically. By eliminating the bodies, he sought to eliminate the consequences. The tools used, a saw, scissors, and an axe, were all items easily accessible within the home or garage. This suggests limited outside preparation, but also reflects a confidence that the act could be contained. There was no indication that Chandler expected to leave. He continued to occupy the house, interact with family acquaintances, and build upon the cover story of his parents' alleged trip. That confidence, however, began to falter. A neighbor's doorbell camera placed Chandler in the vicinity of the disposal site, at a time inconsistent with his own timeline. Cadaver dogs alerted on the trunk of his vehicle. A search of the family computer revealed deleted documents tied to forged emails and correspondence. Each discovery peeled back a layer of control, but the core remained unchanged. Chandler never showed remorse. He never expressed grief. He never deviated from the assertion that he had done nothing wrong. This emotional vacancy, cold, persistent, and unwavering, is a central feature in the psychological structure of the case. It raises a critical question for forensic and behavioral experts alike. Was this a young man pushed to a desperate choice, or was the removal of his parents simply a calculated means to preserve his self-constructed reality? The answer may lie not in what Chandler did, but in how calmly he lived in the aftermath. By the time Chandler Halderson was formally questioned by detectives, the constructed narrative of a tech internship, collegiate enrollment, and a cabin getaway had already been dismantled by evidence. What remained was a set of behaviors that provided clearer insight into his psychological makeup than any confession could. Confronted with contradictions, Chandler defaulted to vague responses and performative concern. When pressed about forged emails, he claimed memory lapses. When shown digital evidence of document manipulation, he suggested errors or misunderstandings. These were not spontaneous defenses. They were rehearsed evasions, deployed with the same calculated tone used throughout his initial statements. He did not deny, he redirected. This tendency, observed consistently during interviews, aligns with high-functioning individuals exhibiting antisocial personality traits, those who lie with ease, not to deceive emotionally, but to maintain dominance over information. One of the most revealing pieces of behavioral evidence came in the form of a text message. Sent from Krista's phone to Chandler, it read like a routine check-in. "Made it safely. We're at the cabin. Love you." The message was time-stamped 2 days after Krista had been killed. GPS data confirmed that the phone had never left the local area. Forensic examination showed that the message was sent from Chandler's own Wi-Fi network. This digital fabrication, meant to reinforce the lie of his parents' voluntary absence, was not a last-minute improvisation. It reflected premeditation, technical forethought, and an understanding of how others perceive digital proof. His manipulation extended beyond devices. Interviews with his girlfriend revealed a pattern of subtle control, strategic omissions, emotional appeals, and behaviors designed to isolate and pacify. He frequently told her not to worry, downplayed serious concerns, and feigned victimhood when questioned. After the murders, He remained physically close to her, staying at her family's property, engaging in daily routines, and attempting to maintain normalcy despite the evidence unfolding around him. This behavioral duality, committing extreme violence while projecting calm intimacy, demonstrates a level of compartmentalization that is central to individuals with psychopathic features. As the investigation progressed, Chandler's detachment became more pronounced. During the search of the Halderson home, he watched officers examine bloodstains and remove evidence without displaying signs of distress. His affect remained flat, his posture relaxed. He expressed concern only when personal electronics were seized or when asked about his online accounts. At no point did he ask about his parents' welfare, nor did he express hope they would return safely. This absence of empathy, particularly when juxtaposed with overwhelming evidence of loss, was not subtle. It was stark. Clinical analysis of this behavior suggests more than simple denial. It reflects an entrenched belief in the supremacy of self-narrative, even when faced with collapse. Individuals with this profile often possess a distorted internal logic. If they continue to assert the lie and maintain control over their environment, the truth becomes negotiable. Their reality is not grounded in external facts, but in their ability to manipulate perception. During pre-trial hearings, Chandler's legal strategy mirrored his psychological strategy. He avoided direct answers, refused to testify, and insisted on minimal participation. His communications with attorneys revealed no emotional reflection, remorse, or even frustration. Instead, he maintained that he had been misunderstood, framed, or wrongly accused. This unwillingness to engage with objective reality, despite irrefutable forensic evidence, demonstrates a core psychological rigidity. For offenders with similar profiles, acknowledgement of guilt is not simply avoided, it is inconceivable. At the center of this case is a personality structure built on deception, sustained by manipulation, and protected by emotional detachment. Chandler did not lash out in a moment of rage. He orchestrated a solution to a threat, his parents' exposure of his lies, and executed it with minimal emotional disruption. This calculation, paired with his continued insistence on innocence, marks a psychological boundary that few cross: the ability to destroy intimacy for self-preservation without psychological breakdown. What remains unexplored is whether this behavioral pattern was isolated to this crisis, or if it had emerged earlier in smaller, unnoticed forms. Were there earlier warnings, minor acts of manipulation, control, or deceit that went unrecognized because the stakes seemed low? The full answer to that question may lie in records never reviewed, conversations never recorded, and in the psychological echoes left behind in those who knew him best. The trial of Chandler Halderson unfolded with the predictability of a forensic puzzle, whose pieces had long been scattered but now clearly aligned. Presented with overwhelming digital evidence, physical remains, surveillance footage, and a sequence of forged documents, the jury reached a verdict with speed and unanimity. Guilty on all counts, 2 charges of first-degree intentional homicide, along with charges for falsifying information, mutilating a corpse, and obstructing justice. The sentence: life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Throughout the trial, Chandler maintained the same demeanor observed during earlier stages of investigation: quiet, detached, unyielding. He showed no emotional reaction to the photographs of the crime scene, nor to the testimonies of relatives, colleagues, and law enforcement. In multiple hearings, he chose not to speak in his defense, made no apologies, and never expressed grief. Psychological analysis conducted during court proceedings confirmed the presence of antisocial traits, but not a diagnosable mental illness that would suggest impaired capacity. This absence of affect, particularly when confronted with direct consequences, reflects a rigid cognitive structure, resistant to guilt and introspection. Individuals with such traits often operate from a worldview where others exist as functional extensions of the self. Relationships are transactional, emotions are simulated, and truth is negotiable. Within this framework, the decision to kill is not viewed through a moral lens, but as a calculated method to remove threat or inconvenience. Public and private responses to the trial were polarized. Some viewed Chandler as a pathological liar incapable of empathy, while others struggled to reconcile his calm exterior with the brutality of his actions. Teachers, former classmates, and even extended family described him as quiet, polite, unremarkable. There had been no prior history of violence, no explicit red flags in his social interactions. This disconnect underscores one of the most unsettling aspects of the case: the internalization of pathology beneath an otherwise benign facade. The psychological toll extended far beyond the courtroom. Surviving relatives reported feelings of betrayal and disbelief, with several indicating symptoms of complicated grief. An enduring state of mourning, exacerbated by the calculated nature of the crime. The community, particularly those close to the Halderson family, experienced collective disorientation. The idea that a son could fabricate an entire life, then eliminate his parents to preserve that illusion, challenged core assumptions about familial bonds and personal accountability. From a forensic psychology perspective, this case highlights the rare intersection of narcissistic self-construction and antisocial execution. Chandler did not kill to gain money, property, or freedom in any conventional sense. He killed to prevent exposure. The motivation was psychological preservation, avoiding humiliation, maintaining control, and silencing contradiction. Each lie he told, each step he took to erase evidence, served the same function: to delay collapse. When deception was no longer sustainable, violence became the solution. What distinguishes this case is not only the brutality of the acts, but the emotional vacuum in which they occurred. There were no outbursts, no confessions, no remorseful apologies. Only silence, denial, and a continuous, almost clinical attempt to maintain a narrative that had long ceased to be believable. In this context, the life sentence is more than a legal outcome. It is a symbolic endpoint to a constructed identity built entirely on falsehoods. Ultimately, the Halderson case serves as a cautionary example of how sustained deception, when left unchecked, can metastasize into violence. It underscores the importance of early detection in behavioral manipulation, especially within family systems where love and trust can be exploited for control. It also challenges conventional assumptions about what danger looks like, reminding professionals and communities alike that sometimes the most dangerous individuals are not those who erupt, but those who persist in silence. A life was sentenced in court. But long before that, another life, authentic, accountable, human, had been abandoned in favor of a narrative so fragile that it demanded the erasure of anyone who dared to challenge it.